Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to have all of you with us here in person, and it's great to have all of you watching at home that are live streaming this. As many of you know, yesterday marked the 150th anniversary of the birth of Winston Churchill. And we gather here tonight with friends and partners, two wonderful scholars, to delve deeper into the great significance that this man had in the 20th century. Now, of course, some of you peeked ahead. This month, we also mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle the United States has ever fought. As we kind of bring those two together this evening, I think we have a wonderful event. Now, I'd like to begin the evening by asking that any World War II veterans, homefront workers, or Holocaust survivors, please stand or wave and be recognized. And what we can do is let's applaud and assume some of them are watching at home. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. We'd also ask any veterans of other eras, now pre-World War II or after World War II, would you please stand or wave and be recognized for your service as well? Thank you very much. Now, we know none of that's possible. None of that service can take place without the family members of those veterans and service members out there and who keep the focus, the home fires burning. I'd ask, family members of veterans or active duty military, would you also stand or wave and be recognized, please? Thank you. Ooh. So this is how everybody gets their exercise in. We have people. Now, we've got a great evening ahead of us, but it's certainly made possible by the generosity of many of the people here. First, I'd like to ask any of the museum's Patriot Circle and charter members, would you stand and be recognized as well? Thank you very much. And then, of course, this evening, we have our partners from the Churchill Society. Would you also, some of you, Greg, you get to stand every time, but, how about if we recognize you and say thank you as well? Churchill Society members? Now, I promise you, your speaker will be much more interesting this year than last year. We also, oh, it is true. We also have with us a few other folks that I think deserve special note. Dr. Nick Mueller, founding president and CEO emeritus. Nick, where are you hiding? There he is. All right. Some of our trustees, Robert Pretty, Mike Byland. Thank you very much. Ann Abbott, wife of Herschel Abbott, our past chair of the board. Ann, it's good to see you again. Thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge Shirley Corey, whose husband, Orlin Russell Corey, was a champion of both of these organizations and whom tonight's program is named after. So thank you very much. Now, lastly, I'd like to thank our guest speaker, Anthony. We had the pleasure of hosting him as the opening keynote lecturer on our Battle of Bulge Symposium for our international conference. And oh, by the way, that was 2 weeks ago tomorrow. And so we've made him an international traveler a few times over. But he's been a great sport about that. Anthony's he was well received there, but he's an incredible author. If you ask him how many books he's written, he'll give you this answer like over 60, about 60, somewhere around 60, maybe 60. We could all hope to produce a fraction of 60 books as we move forward. So I think you all are in for a treat tonight. I'm looking forward to this for the subject this evening, incredibly fitting. not only the Battle of the Bulge, but also Winston Churchill, with an amazing author that could pull those two subjects together in one talk. It's pretty amazing. And with that, Greg, it's almost you. It's my pleasure to pass the podium to our friend, the president of the Churchill Society of New Orleans, Greg Collins. So Greg, over to you.
Didn't used to need these. It's so good to be back here in this magnificent building, which was the original building that started this whole incredible complex that we now call the National World War II Museum. This, of course, then was called the D-Day Museum. It's dedicated to leadership, but it's also dedicated to the foot soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen and ground crews, and Coast Guard crews who all worked together to win World War II. Orland Russell Corey was a member of the Greatest Generation, serving in the Navy in World War II. He was also a thespian, a constant performer at this museum, and a member of the cabinet of the Churchill Society of New Orleans. Legally, board of directors, but we call ourselves the cabinet. Orland continues to provide us with inspiration to learn about the history of both World War II and Winston Spencer Churchill by this lecture series, which, as Michael mentioned, is named in his honor. We're able to partner with the World War II Museum as a result of the generous contributions made to the Churchill Society by our members and donors, both named and anonymous. As Prime Minister of the Churchill Society of New Orleans, and on behalf of the Society, its cabinet and members, I welcome you to this, the 5th Orland Russell Corey Lecture. Anthony Tucker Jones and his wife Amelia have come back to us after 2 weeks from Devon, England. His newest book is Churchill, Cold War Warrior. Last night, he spoke at the Churchill Society of New Orleans annual dinner celebrating the 150th anniversary of the birth of Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. And as Mike mentioned, this is his second trip in 2 weeks, very Churchillian of him in terms of how he's traveled of late. His last presentation for the 4th Orland Russell Corey Lecture was on his first book on Churchill, Churchill, Master and Commander, and masterful that presentation was. Tonight, in an interview format with Dr. Bradley Hart, the World War II military historian at the museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Anthony and Dr. Hart will discuss 2 of Anthony's books, the most recent being Churchill, Cold War Warrior, along with his other book on the Battle of the Bulge called Hitler's Winter, the German Battle of the Bulge. They will explore the effects and result of the Battle of the Bulge with the beginning of the Cold War and decisions over how and which of the Allies would take over the German capital of Berlin, and of course other countries. Anthony's CV, as Michael mentioned, reads like a book in itself. He was defense analyst as the UK Intelligence Liaison Officer for the United Nations Special Commission for Iraq from 1994 to 1995, and the Liaison Officer for NATO from 1991 to 1994. He was the Counter-Terrorism Coordinator in charge of the Defense Intelligence for the Department of Defense from 2001 to 2002, right after 9/11. The newest addition to his CV is its appearance in a Netflix series entitled Churchill at War, which is being released tonight, December 4th, across the world, probably during part of our evening here. So you can see he's stamped his ego down just to be here with us tonight. How great is that? I've seen a preview of the series. Some people call it a trailer. I never get that. It does look intriguing. The world's fascination with the great man, Winston Churchill, will never end. Anthony has had a lifelong interest in Winston Churchill and has just written his second book on the great man, and I look forward to this interview between Dr. Hart and Anthony Tucker Jones. Anthony, Dr. Hart?
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. At the outset, I have to say something that I've honestly never said before in my life, which is thank you, Prime Minister, for that very kind introduction. One thing left off there for our Churchill Society friends here is that I'm actually a graduate of Churchill College, Cambridge. So very proud to be representing sort of the Churchill legacy here, and a subject of interest for me for a number of years of my life now. Anthony, how do we start a conversation like this when we're covering such a broad scope of things? As we've just heard, this year marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land engagement ever fought by the U.S. Army, but also a critical moment in the history of the Second World War, and the history of Sir Winston Churchill's really role not only in the war itself, but in the post-war world as well. So I want to start by taking us into the dark forest of the Ardennes, if you will, in December of 1944, again, exactly almost to the day, 80 years ago. After the German offensive fails, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the event that we know as the Battle of the Bulge, it seems fairly clear to me, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, that the war is going to come to an end, and the Allies are going to win. The Germans have essentially expended their last offensive capabilities in the Battle of the Bulge. At this point in the war, once the Battle of the Bulge comes to an end in late December, early January, how are the Allies and the Germans thinking about the war? How especially is Winston Churchill thinking about how the war is going to end and what each side wants to get out of whatever solution, if you will, or end to the war is going to come about?
Yeah. Well, one of the problems that the Allies faced towards the closing days of the Second World War is they'd agreed amongst themselves that Germany was going to be partitioned, which, of course, in terms of the subsequent Cold War, you can see was not a good idea. And the problem that Germany had, again, as it's, by the winter of 44, it's losing the war. The problem Germany had was the Allies were insisting that the Axis powers surrender unconditionally, which meant inevitably they would have to disband their armed forces and that they would be occupied. And they weren't prepared to sign up to that. And in terms of the German armed forces, their loyalty was to the Führer. As we all know, there were various attempts on his life, most famously the one in July 1944 when they tried to blow him up. So there were some attempts to remove him. But on the whole, the German armed forces remained loyal. So the problem facing Germany and the Allies from different perspectives was what was post-war Europe going to look like. And you're right, in terms of the Germans launching that offensive with the benefit of hindsight, we all know it was a complete waste of time, and it's difficult to wrap our heads around why on earth Hitler insisted on doing it. But one of the things he was trying to do desperately was to buy Germany time, because he thought with the Ardennes offensive, if he could deliver a blow to the Western Allies, so the British and the Americans and the Canadians and the French, it would delay the war. They would put combat operations on a hold during the winter of 44-45. He would then redeploy his armies, which he'd rejuvenated just before the Ardennes offensive. He would redeploy those to the Eastern Front and deliver a similar blow to the Red Army. And he hoped that would buy Germany time, and more importantly, in his fevered mind, he thought he then might get some sort of armistice settlement out of the Allies, that they might rescind that unconditional surrender demand. In terms of how Churchill saw the whole thing, his concern increasingly was how post-war Europe was going to look. And one of the main problems he had was he knew that the occupation of Eastern Europe was going to be a fait accompli because the Red Army was winning quite dramatically from the summer of 44 when they had launched their version of D-Day. So they had this thing called Operation Bagration, which made enormous gains against the German army on the Eastern Front and got them to the very gates of Warsaw. So it was apparent that the Red Army was going to overrun Eastern Germany fairly quickly and eventually get to Berlin. So for Hitler, Freudian slip there, for Churchill, his problem was what was post-war Europe going to look like. And one of the errors I think he made was in October 1944, so just before the Battle of the Bulge, he had traveled to Moscow to try and cut a deal with Stalin, and he did this without the agreement of Roosevelt. He traveled to Moscow and during a rather nice meal, cigars, brandy, and champagne like he normally did. The Russians, despite the war, were surprisingly good hosts. Every time they hosted the Allies, there was no shortage of food or liquor or alcohol or tobacco.
Very boozy meetings,
yeah,
I think they
it was
had.
a very
Yeah,
busy meeting. And Churchill, in a moment of sort of drunken bonhomie, he scribbled down on the back of a napkin what he himself dubbed the naughty document, whereby he agreed that he would be happy to allow the Soviet Union to have dominance in Eastern Europe, as long as the Soviets kept out of Greece. He was desperate to save Greece from the communists, where the communist resistance was very powerful. And likewise in northern Italy, which the Germans had occupied post-September 1943, he was trying to save northern Italy also from the communists, because again, the Italian communists were the most powerful resistance organization in northern Italy. So he tried to cut this deal, but in doing so, of course, he actually sowed the seeds for the Cold War, because he signaled to Stalin that the Western Alliance were probably going to tolerate a lengthy occupation of Eastern Europe, which I don't think he should have ever done.
So you talk about the October 1944 meeting in Moscow where he makes these agreements. What's surprising to me, as someone who's looked into Churchill's career a bit myself, he's so virulently anti-communist in the 1920s. He talks about strangling communism in the cradle, I think is the actual quote that he attributed to. So how do you attribute his change of heart, if you will, or change of political perspective late in the war, essentially guaranteeing, if you will, or at least conceding these spheres of influence for an ideology that 20 years before he would have seen as totally unthinkable?
Yes, and I mean, because he was, a virulent anti-Bolshevik and anti-communist, Stalin never really trusted him. I think Stalin said everything that he wanted to hear. Churchill and indeed Roosevelt both hoped that they could somehow persuade Stalin of the merits of democracy, and they failed with that, obviously, with Poland. But the pair of them, I think, both felt, because they had quite a good relationship with the Soviet leader, that they could somehow turn him around to the Western way of thinking, which of course was an impossibility. We all know how how Stalin had conducted himself during the 1930s. There'd been the purge of the Red Army. There'd been the terrible famine in the Ukraine with collectivization. So he wasn't going to mend his ways. But in a way, both Churchill and Roosevelt rather misguidedly felt that they could somehow temper Stalin's worser instincts, I think. And that's partly what drove them. And as I said previously, the problem both Churchill and Roosevelt had in terms of post-war Europe, of course, the Red Army was going to roll into Eastern Europe come what may. The problem they had was how long they stayed there.
So do you think that Churchill, at this point, is thinking in October of '44, this is a temporary occupation? At some point, we'll renegotiate this later on, or do you think that he is seeing Bolshevism, communism as a permanent feature in Eastern Europe, and that's just something that the Allies have to deal with in a realpolitik way?
Yes, I think so. And of course, as we all know, he operated on that, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So, 1940, Britain's on its own. So for Britain, Hitler invading the Soviet Union was a bit of a godsend, because it took pressure off Britain. It rescinded the threat of Operation Sea Lion and a Nazi invasion of the British Isles, which of course is why famously Churchill and Roosevelt shipped an awful lot of military equipment to the Soviet Union to help keep the Red Army in the fight. I mean, during 1941 and 42, the war was a complete disaster for the Soviets. They didn't really know what they were doing. Every counter-offensive they launched, every counterattack, the Germans easily dealt with. And certainly in 43, well, late 42, it really did look like the Red Army was going to collapse, but they managed to learn from the hard school of Knox how to actually eventually deal with the Wehrmacht.
And of course, Lend-Lease helps as well.
Yeah, Lend-Lease. and that all took time. So, and obviously then America enters the war in December 1941. So again, Britain then finds itself with two major allies. One of them not as pleasant as the other, but the reality of the situation is Britain and America needed the Soviet Union in the fight, because by 42 we were not ready to open a second front in Europe, which is what Stalin always wanted. I mean, as we know, it didn't take place until June 44 with D-Day, and that was a long wait for the Soviets. I mean, it began to sour relationships between, Moscow, London, and Washington, because Stalin could not understand why the West was taking so long to liberate France.
One thing that I found fascinating in your book, Churchill Cold Warrior, is one part of the war that was a closely guarded secret for a number of decades, actually, after 1945, and it's called Operation Unthinkable. And if you're not familiar with Operation Unthinkable, there's a book available in the back that will tell much more about it. But tell us about Operation Unthinkable. What was it? Why is it such a closely guarded secret? And what does it really tell us about Churchill as a leader in a lot of ways?
Well, I mean, that plays into what you were just saying about, was Churchill going to acquiesce to the occupation of Eastern Europe? Well, the flip side of that is, just before the British general election in July 1945, Churchill tasked the British chiefs of staff, so the heads of our armed forces, to come up with a feasibility plan, which was very aptly named Operation Unthinkable, which was to start the Third World War. And Churchill's thinking was, before Britain and America wound down its armies in Europe, the time was right to strike a blow against the Red Army and physically forcibly eject it from Eastern Europe, by waging a war on Russia.
Yeah.
And the problem with that plan was, it rapidly became apparent that, Churchill never got the agreement of Roosevelt, plus his plan envisaged rearming the German army, which, bearing in mind we'd only just defeated it, was unthinkable. And likewise, we would have had to use Polish troops as well. But the irony was, the plan is that the British chiefs of staff came back to Churchill. They really did not want to conduct that, what was really a paper exercise. They didn't want to do it. But they came back to him and they essentially said to him, the Western Allies will have to conduct Operation Barbarossa, which is what, of course, Hitler had done in June 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. He said the Allies will have to conduct a very similar invasion of European Russia, because to keep the Red Army out of the fight, we're going to have to occupy the Soviet Union as far as the Ural Mountains, which is a really long way. By that stage in the war, the Red Army is really battle-hardened, and it knows what it's doing. So the idea of actually picking a fight with them, in July 1945, is mind-boggling, quite frankly. But I think Churchill was really just going through the motions to see whether it was feasible. Now, fortunately for the world and everybody else, a general election interceded, and Churchill lost the election and was out of office anyway. So Operation Unthinkable then morphed into, what will the Allies do if the Red Army rolls into Western Europe? So it became a defensive plan. But the offensive side of it was so politically embarrassing. If that had been made public at the time, it would have wrecked Churchill's legacy. It would have confirmed everyone's worst fears about him being a warmonger. And those plans were kept under lock and key until they were made public in, I'm going from memory, the early 1990s, I think, because they were considered so inflammatory as to what he was suggesting.
Before we talk about that 1945 election, where Churchill actually loses remarkably after winning the Second World War, I want to think about his wider career. You've written 2 books on Churchill now. You're certainly an expert on him. He has this career in which he goes from failure to great success in a lot of ways, I think we can say. He has this career where he holds essentially every high office in the British government at various points. But at each stage, up until he becomes prime minister, and even in some ways up until 1945, he's dealt a great defeat. And I think in some ways the Churchillian sort of mentality, the Churchillian moment, is coming back from these defeats. So can you tell us more about sort of the defeats he's suffered, and how does he come back from these moments where I think a lot of us, frankly, would just say our career is over, effectively?
Yeah. Well, throughout, as I'm sure lots of you know, throughout Churchill's career, particularly his political career, it was quite a car crash at times, because he courted controversy in everything he did. He served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so was in charge of the British economy, didn't do a good job of that, got himself into hot water when he was Home Secretary by turning up on the streets to a siege. Obviously, when he was First Sea Lord during the First World War, he was mired in controversy over the Gallipoli landings. When he was Colonial Secretary, there was the issue of what do we do with Palestine, what do we do with Iraq. So he was constantly caught in controversy, and I think deep down he quite liked it because, of course, it upped his profile in the British media all the time. You know, he was an original spin doctor. But the important thing with all those jobs he'd done, when it came to May 1940, he was probably the most qualified man for the job because he'd done all those high government offices. So he knew what was involved in running the country. And indeed, thankfully, he knew what was involved in waging a global war. So he was well qualified. But the important thing to remember, of course, in May 1940, he didn't win an election. You know, he was an emergency appointment at the head of a British coalition government, so he didn't win an election.
Nor was he head of the party. He'd not had the Conservative Party initially.
Head of the party, and of course, and also a lot of them actually didn't want him in the job. I think quite a lot of his colleagues who didn't, they never really trusted him because, as we know, he started off as a Conservative, became a Liberal, and then walked back across the floor of the House of Commons back to the Conservative. So a lot of his peers felt he wasn't trustworthy. And also, I think when he was appointed in May 1940, I think a lot of people felt he's a caretaker prime minister. He's going to make a complete mess of this, and then we'll get rid of him and someone else can step in and take over. But of course, as we know, he didn't make a mess of it. He actually made a pretty good job of it. But by the end of the war, of course, his profile was enormous because he loved international travel. You know, he reveled in being one of the big three, you know, with Roosevelt and Stalin and then Truman. He reveled in that. He reveled in being on the global on the global circuit, the global platform, and I think he excelled in that task as well. So when it came to the end of the war, the Conservative Party, it had been agreed there would be an election when Germany was defeated, not at the end of the Second World War. So, of course, the important thing to remember is Britain and America are still at war with Japan, and a lot of Churchill's colleagues felt that that election should not have been held until, as it transpired, August 1945, when Japan surrendered. But it was conducted in July 45. And Churchill and the Conservative Party, I think, rightly believed that they were going to be a shoo-in because his profile was such, and he'd done such a good job, that he was going to win that election. But as it transpired, of course, our elections are about party politics and policy. You know, we don't vote for the individual, although increasingly that's not the case. We're not supposed to vote for the individual at the head of the party. We're voting for what they have on offer in terms of helping the nation. And the Labour Party pretty much had better policies on offer. And crucially, a lot of British servicemen still overseas, obviously, when they came home, they wanted a new start. And Labour seemed to offer that. So much to his dismay, Churchill lost that general election.
And the other part of this that fascinates me as a historian of this period is the role of appeasement in all this, right? I mean, appeasement is associated with the Conservative Party prior to Churchill becoming prime minister, associated especially with Neville Chamberlain. To what extent do you think that history of appeasement up until 1940, when Churchill becomes prime minister, plays into the electorate's calculations or votes in 1945, or is that distant memory at that point?
I think it probably is a factor, and I guess probably, again, that probably weighed on the minds of some of the military in that Britain was so woefully unprepared when war broke out. Fleet wasn't in too bad a condition. The British Army was not in a good place, really, when war broke out. Thankfully, the RAF was in a really good position. You know, that sort of narrative of Britain being on its own and facing defeat in 1940 with the Battle of Britain, the one thing we had done and we got right was fighter command was up and running, and we had that chain of radar. You know, so when the Blitz started and the Germans started attacking the RAF, you know, airfields and our cities, actually we had the wherewithal to fend them off. Again, as I'm sure most of you know, it was a near-run thing. We did come close to defeat, but actually we were pretty well prepared to meet that particular threat by good fortune. You know, our air commanders had kind of foreseen developments, particularly with the Luftwaffe. You know, we were well aware that they'd actually, in defiance of Versailles, were building fighter aircraft and bombers, and at some point were going to be a threat to us. So thankfully we'd addressed that. Of course, what we'd pretty done is we were late to the table with reforming the British Army, you know, which is why it was not really in a good condition when it went to France to help the French.
So let's go to July of 1945. Churchill loses this election, which I think is astonishing to a lot of people. A man who's just won the greatest war in human history in a lot of ways, or at least minimally helped Britain survive, let alone win it, right? loses an election to the Labour Party, which hasn't been in power for quite some time in this period. So in some ways, they're untarred by the appeasement period, but at the same time, they're untested, although Attlee has been part of the governing coalition. Churchill, sort of after this defeat, sort of retires to France, where he embarks on his painting hobby for a while. But how does he respond from your reading personally to this? It must have been a huge blow.
Yeah, I mean, he put a brave face on it. He tried to make out it didn't really matter, but it was a massive personal blow to him. I mean, why wouldn't it be? You know, he'd been our figurehead, our wartime leader, and he desperately wanted to, you know, to help the country recover after the war. There's that famous poster, you know, with him on it, which says, "Let us go forward." But it turned out Britain didn't want to go forward with Churchill, which was the great tragedy of it. So yes, you're right. He packed himself off to France and went off and did some painting. And I think he probably did a lot of soul searching. Because in the wings, he had his protege, Anthony Eden, who was the prince in waiting, you know, poised to take over.
And a son-in-law.
Yeah, and a son-in-law, so he was a relative. And likewise, Harold Macmillan, again, very competent, very experienced conservative politician. So there were two men waiting in the wings to take over. You know, Churchill was not a young man by that stage. But I think, going back to what I said about him being an emergency appointment in May 1940, I think it weighed heavily on him that he actually had a point to prove, that he still had more to offer the nation. But also, in terms of his political career, the crowning moment would be for him to win a general election, which is why he remained head of the Conservative Party post-war, which of course meant he was head of the opposition in the House of Commons, so remained in office. And also, in a way, the Conservatives, although they lost that election in July 1945, they were sort of damned with him and damned without him. You know, his value as what we would call a brand today, if you like, was so strong, they knew really their best chance of getting back in office was with Winston, much to the annoyance of poor Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan.
Which has consequences later on. When you come to the Suez Crisis, of course, the Anthony Eden takes office much later than he perhaps should have as Prime Minister.
The great irony with Churchill, of course, is post-war. He remains, you know, the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, and wasn't in the country very much. You know, because obviously he came over here to America to do, eventually to do, you know, the Fulton speech in 1946. He swanned around Europe, you know, talking to governments, being hosted by universities. You know, he ended up with a stack of honorary doctorates. So again, you know, he got himself back on that international speaking circuit, you know, enjoyed the limelight. And a lot of his Tory, you know, colleagues back in London were thinking, he's supposed to be leading the party back to another electoral victory, and where is he? He's in the White House. You know? And of course, for Labour, that was really annoying because he was not the official representative of the British government, but carried on like he was. You know, again, famously with Fulton, Missouri, you know, President Truman took him there to the alarm of, you know, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, because it looked like Churchill was speaking with the authority of the British government, which he was not. He was speaking, okay, perhaps on the authority of the Tory party, but again, a lot of them weren't agreeing with what he said. He was there as an individual citizen, but of course, with a global platform, which he knew everyone was going to listen to.
It's a very odd moment, as you say. I mean, so what is the Fulton speech? Why is this such an important moment? I mean, you talk about this extensively in your book, obviously. Is this the moment that Churchill becomes a Cold War warrior, in your mind?
Yes. Well, of course, it makes him, it's that defining moment post-war. I mean, that's what we all remember him for, isn't it? It's for Fulton. We don't really remember him for being Prime Minister from 1951 to 55. That's not really on our radar. It's because of the subsequent Cold War. It's that speech. When I was writing the book, I do think that's one of the ironies, that he's the, you know, he issues that siren call that the Soviet Union now is a major threat and we are facing a third world war potentially, is actually he played a part, of course, in sowing the seeds for the Cold War because of what he did in October 1944. But of course, we all see him now with the benefit of hindsight as this great herald, whereas at the time, that speech did not go down well. It was not well received. Truman very famously distanced himself from it quite quickly. In fact, I think, I'm going from memory, claimed that he'd not read it, whereas actually on the train down there, Churchill had shown it to him because, of course, what Churchill said then got Truman in trouble because it looked like, well, does America agree with Churchill? And, is the West now gearing up for another war against the Soviet Union? As you can imagine, that speech did not go down well in Moscow because it said, Churchill saber-rattling and trying to organize an alliance against a former ally. So he got, I say we now see it as a defining moment, but at the time, it wasn't well received because, the world was a year out of a global war. The last thing they wanted to hear is Churchill going, we've just defeated Nazi Germany and we're probably about to face another global conflict. I mean, it's just, people didn't want to hear that.
It was almost a reversion to his previous view of Bolshevism as this unstoppable force that must be confronted.
Yeah, and indeed, and unfortunately played to that narrative that a lot of people had of him, that he was a warmonger. He's back to his old tricks. He's
Which conservatives had said this about him, the appeasers in the Conservative Party.
He's foremost a warlord, that's what he does best, and he's back on that routine of, let's get ourselves ready to fight what was the Red Army and then subsequently became the Soviet Army. Let's get ourselves ready to fight a global war. But to be fair to him, he always said, particularly with his second term of office, that his one goal was to try and head off the Third World War, which fortunately we didn't have one. So I think he bears a little bit of credit for ensuring that, as we know, the Cold War wasn't cold because it ended up hot in a lot of places, but he ensured that all those little conflicts did not become joined up like the Second World War did in a much bigger conflagration.
So let's talk about this second term, if you will, for Churchill, which a lot of Americans don't know about. I mean, I think Americans think about Churchill as being the World War II prime minister, but he does have this term that he wins in 1951. He lasts a bit of time in that. His health is failing at that point. Why does he run in 1951? What's the impact of his victory, and what do you see as the importance of that in terms of the development of the Cold War later on?
Well, I think the key thing, of course, it's testimony to the fact that the Labour government did not deliver post-war. They were in office for 5 years. There was actually an election in 1950, and Labour won again, but their mandate was so small, they ended up with a very reduced majority of members of Parliament that they couldn't get any legislation through, and they were forced back to the ballot box, and there was another general election. And Churchill scraped in again by a not a great majority, but of course was delighted that he'd proved his point, he'd won a general election. But of course for Churchill, he was just short of his 77th birthday, when he became Prime Minister for a second time, so not a young man. By good fortune, he was surrounded by very good ministers, and of course he had Eden and Macmillan at his shoulder helping. But for him, the world and Britain was a completely different place from that it had been during the Second World War. And not only was Britain facing the escalating Cold War, so the standoff in Eastern Europe, by that stage we'd had the Berlin crisis with the Berlin airlift. The Korean War had broken out, and of course that looked like it might drag in communist China and the Soviet Union. So again, the world felt like it was at the cusp. So Churchill was desperately trying to head all that off, but at the same time was facing the problem of dismantling the British Empire, which, as we all know, was something very dear to him. He was a child of the empire. And Labour had started that process by granting India independence and, of course, withdrawing from the Palestine mandate. And with the loss of India, of course, that kind of was really the raison d'etre for the empire. He knew that everywhere else was going to want independence as well. So Britain was then facing a series of colonial wars, not so much out of British intransigence, but Churchill wanted to ensure that stable democratic governments took office, and indeed in a number of places, most famously in Malaya, that the communists did not take over.
Mm. So before we open up to questions, I'm sure there's a ton because we're touching so many important and fascinating topics here. As someone who studied Churchill myself, I always ask myself, what is it about this man's character? What is it about him as an individual that allows him to bounce back from these setbacks, and what makes him the man of the hour in 1940 when Britain needs a leader after the catastrophe of what happens in Norway, prior to sort of, or in the period where Dunkirk is taking place. What, from your reading, as someone who's written 2 books about the man, and he's standing behind us right now, no pressure, but what makes him the leader that he becomes? What about his character, his personality? What makes him someone who's able to stand up to this kind of pressure and succeed?
Yeah. I think foremost, bloody mindedness, because that's what we admire in him, isn't it? He just simply did not give up. As I said earlier, he continually car crashed his political career and bounced back. Any lesser man or indeed woman would have given up, because he was constantly suffering humiliation at the hands of the British press. And as we all know, even today, the media can be, a cruel monster.
Just as vicious back then,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah. Fortunately, it wasn't 24/7 like we have now. But yeah, so he bounced back. And I think the other thing is, I was having this discussion the other day. He suffered from famous man syndrome. And of course, a lot of great men, their children often suffer from living in the shadow of their famous parents. It's something difficult to live up to. And in the case of Churchill, of course, Lord Randolph had a very successful political career, had been highly regarded, and until his career came off the rails. And I think for Churchill always wanted the approval of his father, but of course his father died fairly young. And I think for Churchill, throughout his life, he was constantly seeking his father's approval. There was that almost one-upmanship that he needed to do slightly better than his father all the time. And the other thing is he was haunted by his own mortality. Because his father had died at a young age, Churchill had convinced himself that he was going to die at a similar age. So tried to pack in as much into his life before he got to what he thought was his cut-off date. Well, as we all know, he lived to a ripe old age of 90.
Yeah.
Bless him, he proved to be bomb-proof, despite everything that he imbibed and smoked and ate, and I don't think he did a day of exercise in his life.
Yeah, the Churchill lifestyle's not great. We don't recommend it.
But my God, he lived to 90. How did he do that? And particularly in that day and age when life expectancy probably wasn't, on average, wasn't even that. So yeah, I think. I mean, the thing I most admire of him, as I always say, is his just sheer zest for life. That he everything that came at him, if it was negative, he'd dust himself off and keep going. And also, I think slightly, despite what I've just said about him worrying about mortality, his time in the army convinced him he was immortal. Because he'd been shot at a number of occasions and survived. I think he kind of thought he was somehow charmed. Famously at Omdurman and then on the northwest frontier. Even during the Second World War, on a number of occasions he faced death. And I think he kind of thought he was somehow invulnerable. He famously caused kerfuffles for D-Day because he wanted to attend. Mm-hmm. With the Rhine, he wanted to attend. He even as an older man, that siren call of the drums. Again, as I say, deep down he was always that young subaltern, that young lieutenant at heart, that he wanted to be involved. And that's the other thing, he wasn't a leader who led from behind. He always wanted to lead at the front by example, which again, I think is something we all admire in him.
Well, as you say, he petitions the king to land on the first wave, as I recall, at D-Day.
I love that story. Well, the pair of them were like two schoolboys, weren't they, originally? They both agreed that they were going to be on a destroyer for D-Day and that they would witness the opening bombardment and be there. And, of course, the royal household went, well, if you've got the reigning, sovereign and the prime minister on the same ship, we hand the Nazis a major propaganda coup if they sink it. And of course, initially they talked the king out of going. He quite rightly quickly saw sense and went, yeah, maybe it's not such a good idea. I won't go. And Churchill said, well, I'm very sorry about that, but I'm still going. And then the king had to make a personal appeal to Churchill not to be on that destroyer on D-Day. I mean, he basically said, look, you're a trusted, valued friend, valued advisor. I couldn't bear it if I lost you. So please, I'm paraphrasing now, but, please do me a favor and don't go. And Churchill kind of went, well, I don't want you to consider that this is a precedent, that the monarch can tell the prime minister what to do, but dutifully didn't go. I mean, he was in Normandy within about a week of the D-Day landing. So, I mean, he still turned up and was a complete nuisance to poor old Field Marshal Montgomery by insisting on being a battlefield tourist. Monty's fighting a major campaign, has been ashore for 2 weeks, and the Prime Minister turns up. I mean, if a head of state did that now, I mean, can you can imagine the row that there would be in the press, but no, he did that. And again, he did exactly the same thing during the Second World War with the Rhine crossing. He was going, right, I want to be in the opening assault across the Rhine River. I want to be in an assault boat. And again, Monty's going, we need to manage this carefully, because when Winston gets what we call a bee in the bonnet, when he's got an idea in there, he won't give it up. So we need to think of a way of putting him off, but letting him get his own way. So, of course, what they did was they said, well, you can come and sit on a hill and you can watch the opening bombardment and the air assault, and then once it's calmed down a bit, we'll get you over the river, which, of course, they did. And again, Churchill famously went ashore in the area of General Simpson, so, U.S. General, 9th Army, I think it was. Poor old General Simpson's pulling his hair out because he's got the British head of state, British Prime Minister, in his sector where they're being shot at. And, of course, he's kind of pleading with Monty, saying, get him back in the landing craft and back over the Rhine, because I don't want to be held responsible that Churchill's died on American lines.
Imagine the liability with that. Yeah, exactly, precisely.
But, it didn't occur to Winston, the potential ramifications of what would happen if he got himself killed.
But that, I think, is the most Churchillian thing of all, is just this, we have the famous photo behind us here of Churchill sort of in his classic pose. Do you want to actually, since we have this photo up, what's the context of this photo? It's perhaps one of the iconic Churchill photo.
Well, I'm sure a lot of you know, it's a photograph by a famous Canadian photographer, a chap called Yusef Kosh. It was taken when Churchill was in Canada in, I can't remember when, 41, 42.
Yeah, it's early on, yeah.
And Yusef Kosh obviously wanted to record Churchill's visit, so asked him if he would pose for a photograph. And as we all know, that Churchill loved to have a cigar in his hand. It was one of his trademark props. Quite often had a cane or a hat on. So Churchill's there puffing away on his cigar, and Kosh didn't want the cigar in the photo. I think he felt it would the smoke, it would spoil it. So Yusef stepped forward and snatched the cigar from Churchill's hands, and that was the look he got. So, of course, our folklore memory is that's the British Bulldog facing down the Nazi menace, but it's not. He's actually really annoyed that Yusef Kosh has taken his photograph. And again, as we know, it's become known as it's the Roaring Lion, I think. It's the most iconic photograph we have of Churchill. I mean, I think we all agree it's absolutely brilliant, but the story behind it is actually he's cross about something fairly minor, not the Second World War.
So don't take a cigar is the moral of that story, I think is really good. Well, thank you so much for this, Anthony. It's been a great conversation. Let's open up to questions from our audience here. I think we've got some mics coming around. Please raise your hand. We got Connie in the back. Jeremy somewhere.
Please raise your hand. I will come over with the microphone. We'll start right here in the back.
Did he ever visit New Orleans?
That's a good question.
Yeah, good question. Not that I'm aware. No, I don't think he did. I mean, he seemed to have gone just about everywhere else on the face of the planet.
Famously, he's knocked down by a cab in New York.
Yeah. He was very, very well traveled in both Canada and America, North Africa, Europe. Famously, never got to India.
I didn't know.
Well, he'd obviously been there when he was a young lieutenant, so he'd served there when he was in the army, but when he was Prime Minister, he never got back there. Famously, it was felt he should have gone in 1942 when we had that summer revolt, and I think he wanted to go. I suspect he was advised it wasn't a good idea. He could have got shot down, or a Japanese submarine could have sunk the ship that he was on. So, but he didn't go. But yeah, I mean, as we all know, he loved to travel. And he had very rich and wealthy friends who he, in the nicest possible way, liked to freeload off. Famously Lord Beaverbrook, he had lots of properties and things. Churchill always stayed with friends when he went to the French Riviera. Or famously, as you mentioned, at the end of the Second World War, he went off and stayed in Italy for a bit, and he stayed with Field Marshal Alexander, who laid on a villa. Didn't actually belong to Alexander. It belonged to some poor old Italian count, but of course it had been requisitioned by the Allies, and they laid it on for Churchill, and the pair of them happily went off and painted together.
It's nice to have generous friends, I suppose.
Yeah, and also I think that says something about he was good company. I think people liked to host him because he was a raconteur. As we know, he had a wicked wit. He was a good one for the one-liners.
Yeah. Do you want to tell the story about the New York cab incident? I mean, this is one of those moments where history might have gone quite differently.
Yeah, he got him. I mean, Amelia and I have suffered from this in New Orleans. You've got to work out the block system, and of course, if it's one way, we drive on the other side of the road, so we're constantly looking the wrong way, at danger of being run over. I think we've just about mastered it. But Churchill did the same thing in New York, was looking the wrong way, stepped out and was knocked down and quite seriously injured and was, I think, hospitalized.
1921, I want to say, roughly.
Yeah, it was at the time
early
of the Wall
20s,
Street
yeah.
crash. Maybe, I'm not sure whether he got knocked down after he'd learned he'd lost all his money, because of course famously
That's right,
he
yeah.
lost all his investments. So he might have been feeling a bit depressed and had deliberately stepped in front of the cab. I mean, he claimed that that wasn't the case. But the great bookend to that story is, at the time, of course, New York had prohibition. And Churchill, as we all know, liked to drink. So his doctor very kindly wrote a prescription for alcohol.
Which one needed, yes.
Yeah.
But it's one of those moments where had Churchill been killed in this crash in 1921, how history might have been quite different in a terrible way.
And there's a, again, going back to the Second World War, there's that famous story of when he crossed, he was doing shuttle diplomacy with the French, trying to keep them in the fight. And he'd gone off to Paris to see the French premier, and on the way back, they narrowly missed bumping into a couple of Messerschmitts. So he's in a transport aircraft, and at the time, the weather was too bad for Fighter Command to put up an escort to bring him back. And he desperately wanted to get back to London, so he said, no pun intended, let's just wing it, we'll chance it. The weather was a bit bad, so I think he hoped the cloud would mask him. Poor old pilot's like, well, it's Churchill, so we'll go. And they got about halfway across, and much to the pilot's alarm, he spotted 2 Messerschmitts. And if they'd seen that aircraft, they would have shot him down, and that probably would have been the end of him. By good fortune, but not so great for the fishermen, the 2 German fighter pilots spotted a British trawler out in the English Channel, and they went and shot that up instead, and Churchill happily went on his way. So again, it's one of those examples of how he seemed to excel at putting himself in harm's way, but always had the luck of the devil, that he would narrowly escape death.
Another close call that would have changed history,
Yeah.
absolutely. Another question. Who else? We got one up here. Over here.
If Churchill had won the election in 1945, can you speculate on how the Cold War or history might have changed slightly?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, the main thing he would have done would have been to lobby for a get-together of the big three. Post Second World War, that was his one big regret, that he did not get the big three back together. I'm going from memory. I mean, Stalin died in '53 anyway, and they had a series of successor Soviet premiers. But that was one of Churchill's goals after the war. Is he loved those, world leader get-togethers, and I think he felt that they were fruitful and bore results. So if he got in 1945, he would have wanted Truman to go with him to Moscow or somewhere maybe on neutral territory to meet with Stalin to try and discuss the fate of Europe. And I think that might have been quite good. Whether Truman would have been amenable to that, I'm not sure. I somehow doubt. But I think that's what Churchill would have wanted to do. As we discussed, Operation Unthinkable. He might have slowed down the British drawdown in Europe. We might have kept more troops in Europe, which might have upped tensions with the Soviets. He almost certainly would have lent on Truman to slow down the rate of the American drawdown, because obviously America's still fighting a major war in the Pacific, needed to redeploy its divisions. And Churchill would have lent on Truman to slow that process down, because he would have said, we need to keep as many troops in place as possible. And I think the other thing he would have done, which again might have blighted his legacy, was he almost certainly would have slowed down our withdrawal from India. He didn't agree with the pace with which Britain withdrew. He felt that the Labour government and Lord Mountbatten had made a complete mess of that. And I think if he had done that, it would have been disastrous for us. Because post-war, the violence in India was sectarian. It was amongst themselves. And they still reasonably respected the Raj. All the time we kept saying we were going, that was fine. But 2.5 million troops had served loyally Britain during the Second World War. And they were going home. And they'd had military training. And even Churchill must have known that was, at some point, they would turn on us. I always think Mountbatten did the right thing, that, we left. Okay, there was, partition was awful. But the Indians were going to do that anyway. the Hindu and Muslim populations didn't want a United States of India. We ended up with Bangladesh and Pakistan. But I think Churchill would have slowed that process. He would have tried to get a better settlement amongst the Indian leaders, and I think that might have, exacerbated the situation. It would have made it worse.
And that's a key thing. He's a big proponent of the empire as a concept.
And the other thing
really,
that Churchill always did, what he wanted was what I dubbed rather unkindly is empire light. Mm-hmm. Now the whole point with the British Empire is that all the colonies acknowledged the king and then the queen as head of state. So that kind of was the glue that kept the empire together. The contrast to that was with the colonies, they then became independent states, but still recognized the queen as head of state. So it was sort of a half measure. And Hitler, doing it again, Churchill liked that idea of keeping that sort of family of nations together through that arrangement. And my goodness, both India and Pakistan, for at least a year or two, carried on recognizing, at the time, obviously, King George VI, as head of state. They had no reason to do that. They were going to be independent sovereign nations. But even they, for a while, paid lip service to being, basically having what we call dominion status, that they would still recognize the royal family. So again, I think if Churchill had stayed in power in 1945, he would have pushed really heavily for India to continue recognizing the royal family. As we know, the Commonwealth still exists, but very, very few of them recognize the royal family today as head of state. And quite rightly, they're independent countries, why should they? But there aren't many that still do it. But I think Churchill would have been wed to that idea of it sort of remained the empire if even though they've got independence, a self-governing, look after their own foreign policy, they still recognise the royal family, then that somehow kept the empire together.
Another question.
Thank you. When or what was going on when he made the statement, never, never, never give up?
Well, that would be in terms, I guess, of Britain, Britain being on its own, because for a while, from September 1939, well, we had France, I suppose, until May 1940, but certainly from May 1940 up until June 1941, Britain was on its own. And that's one of those great myths of history, because we weren't on our own. It was nonsense. Because the British Empire pretty much stood shoulder to shoulder and all declared war on Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. So, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they all stood shoulder to shoulder. But Britain has this sort of narrative that we like to cling to, that certainly in 1940 it's our finest moment because we were on our own. We weren't. We were fighting coalition warfare. Canadian pilots, New Zealand, Australians, they all flocked to Britain and served in Bomber Command and famously in the RAF and Fighter Command. So we kind of forget, actually, we weren't really on our own. But in terms of, he made it clear that he was not going to negotiate with Nazi Germany, because when he was appointed in May 1940, for a very brief moment, the appeasers in the British government, so those people that had supported Neville Chamberlain in acquiescing to everything that Hitler wanted, they thought for a moment that Churchill might try and negotiate getting Britain out of the war, because obviously France, surrendered, June 1940, after half of it had been overrun. The French, sued for peace, and we were on our own. So for a moment, the war could have gone one of two ways. We carry on fighting, or we negotiate our way out. And Churchill sort of went through the motions. It was suggested that we use Mussolini, of all people, to negotiate. He would be an intermediary with Hitler, and we would negotiate our way out of the war. Now, Hitler's goal really was not the invasion of the British Isles. His stated goal always was living room or Lebensraum in the Soviet Union. That's what he wanted to do. He didn't really want to invade the British Isles. But all the time that we resisted to negotiate a surrender, he was forced to keep up that threat. But I don't think Churchill ever really intended to negotiate. He kind of went through the motions of, yes, we'll put out feelers. And I'm sure for a while he probably may have deep down questioned his resolve, whether or not Britain would negotiate its way out of the war. But I just think he felt the country could not hold its head up high. It would be a shameful thing to do. And also he knew that Hitler would want something. He wouldn't just say, okay, fine, yeah, you're out of the war, that's you know, just stay in the British Isles and the Empire and you leave me with free reign in Europe. He would have said, I want the British fleet demilitarized. I want Gibraltar, maybe. I want Malta. You know, he would have demanded naval bases. There would have been strings attached to us coming out of the war, which Churchill himself pointed out that there would be a cost if we didn't carry on fighting. And from May 1940, really, Britain was playing for time, you know, because even in the House of Commons, Churchill famously said, you know, we're effectively waiting for America because she's the powerhouse, because she's got the industrial muscle, she's got the, you know, the manpower and the population. If America enters the war, then Nazi Germany's in trouble. Britain did not have the industrial clout or the manpower on its own to defeat Nazi Germany. Of course, by a quirk of fate, the Soviet Union entered first before America. But and again, Britain was always very lucky because, of course, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, what would America have done about Germany? Because, you know, Roosevelt then would have had to say, well, the Japanese have attacked us, but the Germans haven't. Now, we all know that Roosevelt desperately wanted to help Churchill and Britain. But Hitler did Britain a favor because the moment the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on America.
In fact, a lot of people don't know in the United States, actually,
so
the German
presented,
version.
Roosevelt with a very convenient fait accompli that there was not a problem for America, you know, entering the war against Nazi Germany because the Germans had gone, well, the Japanese are part of the Axis powers, we're allies. So if Japan's at war with America, so is Germany. So he very helpfully solved that dilemma.
Yeah. You touched on a really odd thing that I've researched a bit myself, which is this idea of negotiating through Mussolini, of all people, which I've never quite figured out why Mussolini. I mean, people have this perception that he's the more rational of these two actors, when in fact Mussolini would never have negotiated any of these deals.
What we of course forget in the mists of time is that Mussolini initially was not the ardent German ally that he became.
Yeah, well, he wasn't in the war to start with either.
No, so for a long time, Italy was looking to France and Britain to counteract the rising power of Nazi Germany. So the Italians, for a long time, kind of sat on the fence because they weren't sure. You know, okay, it was a fascist country, you know, one-party state. But even Mussolini was, for a long time, not sure what to do about Hitler. Because, of course, German rearmament was vastly outstripping everyone else's, particularly the Italians, because the Italians had this problem of they'd gone to war in the 1930s, but had not brought forward their war industries or indeed, you know, developed their military equipment. So they'd fought in, you know, Abyssinia, they'd fought in Spain, they'd fought in Libya. They conducted this whole series of wars which you would have thought would have made their military really, really efficient and good, and actually it wasn't, as we know subsequently in May, sorry, not May, but, you know, 1940 and 41 in North Africa.
And in Greece later on.
They came a cropper against us. And in Greece, where, you know, and Albania, where the Germans had to step in and help them. So for a long time, Mussolini kind of knew that Italy was a bit of a paper tiger. It was all bluff and bluster, you know, that it, you know, Mussolini had declared that there was going to be a second Roman Empire, and, you know, Libya was part of reclaiming North Africa for Rome, and, you know, all this, and that the Italians themselves were going to have an empire like you know, France and Britain and elsewhere had. But behind the scenes, they really did not have the military muscle to do it. So he knew that German rearmament was going to be a threat to Italy, so he had to decide which way the wind was blowing. And of course, as we know, eventually opted to side with Hitler, but certainly for a period during the 1930s. Bizarrely, can you imagine the Second World War actually if the Italians had been allies? Which, of course, they were during the First World War.
Yeah,
that's
changed
the other
sides,
thing,
yeah.
is because that we forget. But actually, they fought alongside the Western Allies during the First World War.
Whenever I think about the Hitler-Mussolini relationship, I picture the Charlie Chaplin film, The Great Dictator, and the famous scenes there. If you haven't seen it, absolutely hilarious. It does not name them, obviously, but it's clear who they're talking about. A couple more questions, Connie, if we have time. No?
Ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Tucker-Jones and Bradley Hart.
So sorry to break that up, but you know, in the interest of our guests, thank you both for an engaging conversation. Anthony, thanks for the insights into Churchill leadership and battlefield tourism. Usually a bad idea, but you confirm that. We look forward to having you back. Certainly next time we'll give you a little more respite than we did this time, but you look none the worse, you know, in that process. Anthony will be signing copies of his books by the front of the Higgins boat, back to y'all's left. And please mark your calendars for a few things. So this Saturday is our Pearl Harbor commemoration. Saturday, December 7th. Our next author event will be 16 January. The Baptist Community Ministries Faith in Wartime Lecture will feature Deborah Work and her new book, Saints and Liars, about the individuals who, no pun intended, helped spirit out and rescue those who were in danger of Nazi persecution. And that's Thursday, January 16th. I would note for that one, we're going to start 30 minutes earlier than our traditional time. So, you know, please mark the calendars, check the website for those and the other opportunities. Also, another great partnered program event. I invite you all to check out the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. They'll be hosting our very own Nick Mueller on 12 December as one of their Bright Lights Revealed, where he'll speak on liberation, preserving the legacy of World War II. Now, that's going to be Thursday, December 12th. Nick Mueller. But find it on LEH's site, not here. So visit the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities, leh.org, for more information and to register. Now, after you get your book signed by Anthony, I invite you to join us at Kilroy's across the street for a continued conversation with our historians. We also have, because of our guests, extended happy hour prices from 7 to 9 tonight. So it's a little more than an hour by definition, but I know that all those people that were waiting to ask more questions, you know, there's your chance to pounce on that. And so I want to just say thank you to everyone who's come here. Thanks to Anthony, thanks to the Corey family, and thank you to the Churchill Society. Godspeed and have a wonderful evening.